Hey there! We know that greenhouse gas emissions are really bad for climate change, and you probably know a lot of activities that produce these greenhouse gases. But there's one you might not have thought about, and that's flying. So today, we're going to talk about sustainability in the aviation industry. So let's start with an introduction so we're all on the same page. The goal is always to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, or GGE. Now remember, greenhouse gases are things like carbon dioxide and methane, among others. And flying, or the aviation industry, actually produces a lot of these greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide. And the reason is because aviation, or our airplanes, use fossil fuels to make jet fuel. So fossil fuels are going to be things like coal and oil, and when those get burned, they release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So scientists predict that greenhouse gas emissions are going to increase in the next 50 years or so. Now, our researchers wanted to know how we could achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions in aviation by, let's say, 2050. So let's talk about some of the methods they did to kind of estimate what might happen. So there are three different options or things that could help the aviation industry gain or achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. One is demand. That would be how often people are flying. The second is energy intensity. That's basically how much fuel a plane uses, so how efficient the plane is at burning its fuel. And the third is carbon intensity. That's how much of the fuel that the airplanes are actually using comes from fossil fuels. So our researchers put together these three options into 9 different combinations. So along the x-axis here, we're going to have demand and energy intensity. And then on the y-axis, we're going to have carbon intensity. So let's look at our demand. So on the left-hand side, we have demand that is really high. And then we have a medium level of demand. And then we have a small level of demand. Same thing with energy intensity. Really high energy intensity is on the left, medium intensity in the middle, and a small amount of intensity on the right-hand side. Carbon intensity, again, is going to be on our y-axis. So this is how much of our fuel is going to be from fossil fuels. So at the bottom of our graph, this is going to be where none of the fuel is actually from fossil fuels. In the middle, some of our energy or some of our carbon is going to come from fossil fuels. And then at the top, all of our carbon is going to come from fossil fuels. So let's look at what they actually found. So if we look at the carbon intensity, if we decrease the amount of jet fuel that actually comes from fossil fuels, we're going to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions. If we decrease the demand and the energy intensity, we are also going to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions. That means that the scenario that is going to produce the most greenhouse gas emissions is going to be this one. And they estimate that that combination is going to produce about 3.4 gigatons of emissions per year. If we look in the lower right-hand section of our graph here, that is going to be the combination that is going to result in the smallest amount of emissions. And they estimate that that's going to be about 0.2 gigatons of emissions per year. So what does this all actually mean? Let's get through a little bit of a discussion. Now, that lowest greenhouse gas emission combination is still positive, which means that some carbon dioxide removal is still going to be needed from the aviation industry to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Talking about alternative fuels. Alternative fuels are kind of hard to use at this point because they compete with food resources. Biofuels a lot of the time are made of corn, which is also one of our food resources. Also, it's costly to make alternative fuels currently. So then the question is, does the aviation industry want to update airplane efficiency? Because that would be another way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So in conclusion, Let's talk about what you can do to reduce your fossil fuel use. The first one, based on this article, is reduce the amount of flying that you do. That could mean that you take local vacations instead of going to other countries. You can take public transportation instead of your own car. You could carpool. You could walk, or you could bike if you're close to where you're going. So hopefully these suggestions will reduce your carbon footprint. Hope you learned something. Have a good one.